In 1992, a young man named Christopher McCandless ventured into the wilds of Alaska with little more than a backpack and an idealistic dream. His story, immortalized in Jon Krakauer's book Into the Wild, captured the imagination of millions. After graduating from college, McCandless donated his savings to charity, abandoned his possessions, and cut ties with his family, seeking to escape the constraints of modern society and immerse himself in nature's raw, untamed beauty. He wanted to live, as Thoreau once wrote, deliberately, free from the artificial demands and distractions of the world he'd come to loathe. After a long journey through the American wilderness, McCandless found himself alone in the Alaskan wilderness, living out the dream he'd long fantasized about. Yet, just 4 months after he entered this remote part of Alaska, his body was found by hikers. He had starved to death in an abandoned bus that had served as his shelter. His diary and photographs revealed a tale of survival, solitude, and ultimately, tragedy. But beyond the tragedy lies a deeper and more philosophical narrative. Into the Wild is not just the story of a man who left society behind, it's the story of a quest for meaning. McCandless's journey raises questions about life, freedom, and the nature of happiness. What was he searching for? What does it mean to live a life of purpose? And most importantly, what does his journey tell us about our own? McCandless's story taps into a fundamental human yearning, the desire for freedom. But not just any freedom, the kind of freedom that allows you to shed all the expectations and constraints society places upon you. In McCandless's mind, the truest form of freedom could only be found in isolation, in the heart of nature where there were no distractions and no obligations, only survival and self-discovery. But is that true freedom? We all dream of escape at some point in our lives. The idea of leaving behind the pressures of daily existence for something simpler and more authentic is deeply appealing. But McCandless's story forces us to confront the darker side of this yearning. Does escaping the world bring us closer to who we truly are, or does it sever us from the very things that make life meaningful? McCandless found solitude in the wild, but he also found a kind of isolation that proved fatal. His story suggests that perhaps freedom isn't just about escaping, but about finding balance, learning how to live within the world without letting it suffocate your soul. This philosophical tension between solitude and society is an age-old debate. Consider the ideas of transcendentalist philosophers like Henry David Thoreau, whose work, Walden McCandless, was known to admire. Thoreau retreated to the woods near Walden Pond, seeking a life of simplicity and self-reliance, away from the quiet desperation he believed plagued modern society. He wanted to strip life down to its essentials, to experience the world in its purest form. For Thoreau, the natural world wasn't just a place to escape to, it was a mirror reflecting the truth about humanity's relationship with itself and with the world. McCandless, in many ways, was following in Thoreau's footsteps. But whereas Thoreau returned from his retreat after 2 years, having reflected on the balance between solitude and social engagement, McCandless's story ended in isolation and death. This contrast invites us to question whether total withdrawal from society is ever truly sustainable or desirable. Perhaps the lesson here isn't to escape the world entirely, but to understand how to live in it meaningfully. Let's ask ourselves, what is it about modern society that drives people to seek refuge in isolation? Some might argue that our lives have become too noisy, too fast-paced, and too superficial. The constant pressure to succeed, to fit in, to consume, can feel overwhelming. In McCandless's view, society was a cage, a place where people are defined by their material possessions, their status, and their adherence to arbitrary norms. By rejecting these things, he believed he could find a deeper sense of self. But is this rejection of society the only path to self-discovery? Can we truly find ourselves by cutting ties with the world, or does that sever us from the relationships and experiences that make life rich and meaningful? This brings us to a central paradox in McCandless's journey. While he sought freedom in isolation, many of his writings and reflections toward the end of his life hint at a growing realization that happiness might, in fact, be shared. His famous last note, found scrawled in a book, read, "Happiness is only real when shared." This realization speaks to something human. We are, by nature, social creatures. Even in our moments of solitude, we crave connection, whether with others, with nature, or with something greater than ourselves. McCandless's journey into the wild may have been a quest for self-discovery, but it also highlights the importance of relationships and community. In the end, it seems, his isolation did not bring the fulfillment he sought. Instead, it led him to an understanding that, while freedom and solitude have their place, true contentment might come from meaningful connections with others. There's also a fascinating philosophical question embedded in McCandless's story. What is the role of suffering in the pursuit of meaning? McCandless endured tremendous physical and emotional hardship during his time in the wild, and many have criticized his journey as reckless, even foolish. But if we look at his story through a different lens, it becomes clear that suffering was an integral part of his search for truth. In many philosophical traditions, particularly in existentialism, suffering is seen as a necessary condition for understanding the human condition. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." McCandless's suffering, while extreme, echoes this sentiment. He willingly placed himself in a situation where survival was uncertain, perhaps believing that through hardship he would discover a deeper truth about himself and the world. And in a way he did. His journey reminds us that comfort and security, while desirable, can sometimes prevent us from confronting life's deeper questions. It's only when we are pushed to our limits, when we are forced to face uncertainty and fear, that we truly begin to understand ourselves. But this raises another question. Is suffering always necessary for growth? Can we not find meaning through joy, love, and connection rather than pain and hardship? McCandless's journey into the wild was, in part, an attempt to escape the complexities of human relationships and society. But by the end, it seems he came to realize that these complexities are not obstacles to happiness. They are part of what makes life rich and meaningful. His story suggests that perhaps the pursuit of meaning doesn't require us to reject society entirely, but rather to engage with it in a way that feels authentic and true to ourselves. The philosophy of Into the Wild ultimately asks us to reflect on our own lives. Are we, like McCandless, searching for something beyond the surface-level distractions of modern life? And if so, how do we find it? Is it through solitude, through connection, through hardship, or through a balance of all three? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they are questions worth asking. In the end, McCandless's story is not just about a man who went into the wilderness and died. It's about the human quest for meaning, the tension between freedom and connection, and the role of suffering in shaping our understanding of life. His journey reminds us that while we may yearn for escape, we must also recognize the importance of community, relationships, and the shared experience of being human. We all have our own wild, that place or idea where we believe we will find ultimate freedom and truth. But perhaps the greatest lesson of McCandless's story is that no matter where we go, we cannot escape the complexities of life. Freedom, in its truest form, might not be found in isolation, but in learning how to live authentically within the world, in connection with others, and in harmony with the wildness that resides within all of us.